Hi, welcome back to another episode of Mental Health with Melissa. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more videos on mental health. Today, we are going to be talking about a very important topic and an important term called complicated grief. Everyone experiences grief, whether it be in relation to death, to change, to any type of loss, but it's important to notice when grief becomes complicated. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what complicated grief is. Now, it's important to also remember that this is just a video on some information, and none of this is meant to serve to use as self-diagnoses. You should always see a mental health professional or a licensed clinical therapist in person to be formally assessed. So grief is the response to the loss of someone or something. And conventionally, we've tied the term and word grief to somebody passing away. But really, grief is the response to any type of loss. And grieving is a normal process in response to loss and in response to death. And it's important to recognize when normal grief becomes complicated grief. Now, everybody experiences grief in a different way, but it's really important to make note of grieving that has become dysfunctional. According to Dr. McCall, in her text in 2004 entitled Bereavement Counseling, complicated grief is an extreme form of grieving that complicates day-to-day functioning. And what that looks like is different for everyone, but generally speaking, your day-to-day functioning is going to look impaired. So if in everyday normal life, you're used to being able to cook and clean, go for walks, if you're not able to do any of those things anymore, and this is in response to grief, then you're most likely dealing with some sort of complicated grief. So again, this information is not to be used for self-diagnosis purposes, but in a world full of grief being such a taboo topic, it is important to have psychoeducational information on different grief and grief processes. So also in talking about complicated grief, it's important to take a look at the populations that may be more predisposed to developing complicated grief. So let's go ahead and take a look at the literature to look at those specific populations. The first population that we found in literature that is more predisposed to complicated grief are military service members who experience the loss of a fellow service member in service. In a study done by Simon et al. In 2017, they found that higher levels of complicated grief were found in service members who were diagnosed with PTSD or had lost a fellow service member in combat. Another population that literature found to have higher levels of complicated grief are African Americans. In a study done by Simon et al. In 2017, they found that African Americans were more likely to have prolonged grief disorder as opposed to their Caucasian counterparts. Now you may be wondering, what is prolonged grief disorder? Because we're talking a lot about complicated grief. So in this video, I'm going to use prolonged grief disorder and complicated grief interchangeably. Prolonged grief disorder is a diagnosis in the ICD, also known as the International Classification of Diseases. In addition to that, there's another term or diagnosis called complex persistent bereavement disorder. And that's a diagnosis that is found in the DSM-5. And the symptoms and criteria in that are very similar to prolonged grief disorder and complicated grief overall. And so when I use these terms, I hope that you keep them into consideration and how they are very similar to one another. Another population that has been found to have higher levels of complicated grief are refugees and asylum seekers. Actually, a study by Koku and Koplu et al. 2017 found that Togo Western African immigrants and refugees had higher rates of complicated grief. Additionally, Cambodian refugees had elevated rates of complicated grief in a study done by Hinton et al. In 2013. A study by Nickerson et al. In 2014 found that prolonged grief disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder were at high levels in Mandaean refugees seeking refuge in Australia. So you may be wondering, what can I do if I find out that I have complicated grief, prolonged grief disorder, persistent complex bereavement disorder, or if somebody that I know has one of these diagnoses. Well, there is a screening entitled the Complicated Grief Screening Assessment that is done by clinical individuals that can rule out or diagnose that you have one of these diagnoses. There is also a specific evidence-based practice therapy model entitled Complicated Grief Therapy, which is a 16-session therapeutic model used to treat complicated grief. Now, this may not work for everybody, as this particular evidence-based practice has been used primarily on Westerners and not necessarily on other populations or minorities or with refugees. And so it's really about finding a type of clinical intervention that's going to work for you or your loved one. And so it's very important to talk to a clinical therapist or somebody that can refer you to the right mental health provider. Grief affects us all, and it's really important for us to all grieve. By doing so, we can help take away the stigma of the topic of grieving at hand. Right now is a very interesting time. In this worldwide pandemic, everybody is dealing with grief in their own way. By looking at how we can manage our grief and figuring out if grief is becoming complicated or if it's normal, we can do a better job at managing it and discussing it with those that we care about. Grief can be an interesting and a taboo topic to talk about, like I mentioned earlier, but by talking about it and by opening up about it, it can help open the doors to really healing and being able to have open communication, not just with others, but with yourself, and really start the healing process. So thank you for sitting down with me to talk about grief. It might be a challenging thing to talk about or even to listen to, but with continued open dialogue about it, it becomes easier with time. So thank you and have a great rest of your day.